Hi everyone, Manessa Konecki here, host of the Research Administration in a Nutshell show on Manessa TV. And today we're going to be talking about internal deadlines. I have a lot of thoughts about internal deadlines. So we're going to talk about it in terms of what are they? Why do we have them? Why are they important? What are some problems with them? And so on. But these are just my opinions. I actually would really love to hear from you about your opinions, your experiences. What are your thoughts about internal deadlines? How have things worked for you? This is something that's been a big conversation in research administration for a very, very long time. Some organizations have opted to go one direction, others another. And in this particular video, we'll examine the history of it and how we're going and how some organizations are implementing internal deadlines and how they impact the research administration experience. So without further ado, let's get started. When a PI decides that they want to submit for a grant, the announcement will have a due date for the proposal to be submitted. Typically, a PI will work on the submission for a specified period of time and then get that to the RA for them to review against the sponsor requirements and then send along to the signature official for approval. Now, in some cases, there may only be one stage of review, going from the PI to the signature official who then reviews and submits it. And in others, there may be multiple layers of review, right? So after 25 years and over 1,000 years of collective experience from other RAs to mine from, I can say with confidence that you always want to have more than one set of eyes looking at a grant. 2 is better, 3 is best. These additional set of eyes make sure that the last straggling items get caught. The additional set of eyes makes sure that there are less chances of there being errors. If you only have one person reviewing, the chances of things getting missed are very high. No matter how good you are or how good you've been in the past, human error is a fact. It's not an opinion. And so the checks and balances within the submission process has to account for that. Additionally, each RA can be responsible for multiple grants going in at the exact same deadline, which means that for many of us, we have a very intense time of the year, multiple times a year, where someone opens the floodgates of submissions and others that are fairly calm depending on the sponsor deadlines for your particular group. The internal deadline is implemented by organizations as a date by which the signing official or research administrator needs to have the completed grant application for them to review and submit at an earlier date than the sponsor's published deadline. So if the deadline for the sponsor is January 10th and your organization has a 5-day policy, then you would need to get the grant complete and ready to submit to your RA by January 5th. Anything after that would be considered late. Now, typically organizations publish this on their website so that everybody knows what's expected of them and then provides additional details like whether or not weekends are included and what the exemption policies and processes are. Though this may seem cumbersome as an investigator, these deadlines make a huge difference in the context of support that is provided, mitigating burnout, workload management for PIs and for RAs, and a lot more things that we'll discuss later. Now, it's such a positive framework that organizations across the country have implemented them, some with zero tolerance policies for lateness, and others with very wide policies for lateness. Some are just publications that say, here, this is the policy, but don't actually get enforced. But let me give you an example of what some of the internal deadlines are that you might run into in your career. These are just some of the examples that are here because I want to illuminate the variety of ways in which these deadlines can be implemented. It's not one size fits all. Northeastern University has 5 full business days before the sponsored deadline. University of Pittsburgh has 4 full business days. The University of Michigan has 32 business hours, which is typically about 4 business days before the sponsor deadline. Vanderbilt has 5, but they have an interesting one where they have a scientific version. So the science has to get to them by 5 business days. And then they have a version where the admin can come in before the science. So all the administrative paperwork needs to be in by 5 business days. And then the science needs to be in 2 business days before the deadline. And there's a lot of organizations that have that in place where you can give the administrative stuff first and the science part later. For example, the University of Washington they want to get the administrative paperwork 7 business days prior to the sponsor deadline. But the science needs to get to them by 3 business days before. Okay. Now, as you can see, there are a variety of ways in which one can implement this, and similarly, based off of the policies and procedures of any particular organization, different things may need to be included depending on what the rules are. So each organization will have their own determinations about what needs to be received, but typically it needs to be either completely ready, so give the whole thing ready to submit, and the SO needs to be able to submit it right now, or it needs to be completed with the exception of the science, and then the science documents can go in last. There's often segments where compliance documents have to be included. Be sure to look, whatever organization you're at, be sure to look at what your policies and processes are and what the requirements are for your particular organization. What I can say is that for just about all of them, a partially put together application with the intention of finishing it up later is not typically acceptable. There's a certain benchmark that has to be met before it can be submitted to the RA for review and considered to be accepted. So if you give in sort of like a piecemeal one where there's just a bunch of pieces in there, but it's not administratively ready, that's not going to count as being submitted on time. It needs to be, if we wanted to submit it right now without the science, we could, right? Now, this is how the deadlines are envisioned. This is how they are structured. This is what you may need to include. But then the question becomes, how are these deadlines actually enforced, right? Because if you think about it, if you're working for an organization whose philosophy is to submit grants at all costs to bring in more IDC and more money, or for example, you as an RA work directly for the investigator or for the department, it's actually very difficult to walk the line of holding policy while also doing what your manager perceives to be your job. So it really depends on the organization. Now, many, many years ago, these deadlines used to be enforced incredibly strictly. But as the landscape for research academia has changed, many people really just need to get money in. Organizations are trying to get a lot of money in, which means getting grants out the door. So sometimes there's a difference between the deadline as it is published and how it actually plays out on the ground. Now, other organizations have a zero tolerance policy and will not accommodate late submissions, late grants being ones that were received after the deadline date, and they just won't accept it at all. So it really does depend on your organization, whether these deadlines, the internal deadlines, are like real deadlines, or if they're just deadlines that are, oh, this is the thing that we say, but we never really actually implement any of it, right? That in and of itself can be problematic, but the truth is there are some negatives that come with having internal deadlines. Like, I'm just going to tell you, I am so into internal deadlines. But the challenge is it doesn't change the fact that it really sucks to tell an investigator that I can't submit your grant, who finds out about the grant like 3 or 4 days beforehand, or has an idea there, oh my God, I just talked to somebody and they gave me this idea and I have to submit this grant, right? It's also really hard to feel like a collaborator with your investigator when you're the person who seems like you're actively preventing a PI from getting a project by saying no. If you are a people pleaser like me, this can be incredibly difficult even in the best of circumstances. And so I actually put together a video on how to handle being the person who has to deliver this information or even enforce some of these rules on Manessa.com/boundaries to help get some of your boundary issues sorted out. Now, despite the fact that it does feel icky to say no to investigators, and we may have that overarching philosophy of we have to get all of the grants in, and also we have the people pleasing, it might help to understand why we have the internal deadline and why it even matters. Like, why can't we just submit grants as they come in and like just send them in and whatnot, right? Submitting grant proposals after internal deadlines can have several negative repercussions, because remember that the deadlines are put there to create a fence for checks and balances and so on. So if you are consistently submitting grants that only have a few seconds to review, you're going to experience increased rejection rates, like period. Studies have shown that proposals submitted late have a higher likelihood of being declined because something was missed. For instance, an analysis revealed that non-compliant proposals are more likely to be declined than funded, indicating that there is a strong correlation between timely submission and proposal success. Now, I have definitely submitted grants that have gone in at the last minute. They were an absolute mess and they did actually get funded, right? And I was flabbergasted. I'm like, I do not understand how this grant got funded when we spend so much time and effort making sure that we send in these really, really good grants to the other organizations. Like, the consistency made no sense. So the truth of the matter is that there is always a chance that the grant will get funded no matter how messy it is. However, there is a greater chance. So like, it's one of those things where people always try to use a benchmark for success, like the anomaly, right? Not the standard, but the outliers, right? So there are some that do get accepted even though they're messy, but those are going to be the outliers. Those are not the standard, right? You can read more about this in this article by Haneen El-Haddad, Celeste Rivera, Josh Roney, and the link is on Manessa.com, that talks about these rejection rates and how they correlate with late applications. The other challenge that comes with late applications is administrative withdrawal. Proposals submitted without sufficient time for institutional review may be administratively withdrawn to prevent submission of a substandard application, to lead to missed funding opportunities. Late submissions without valid reasons are typically not processed, reviewed, or considered for funding. So depending on where you get this, where you're submitting to, you may not even have the option to submit late. Like, if you do not submit the perfect application, that's going to be the thing that differentiates you from another applicant whose science was on par with yours and they were just looking for the one thing to say, okay, we need something to be a tiebreaker. Well, this person has great attention to detail and this person doesn't. Oh, well, I guess you're not getting the grant. Now, while a lot of the case studies for things like this and rejections are typically confidential because nobody wants to share how many grants they submitted that were late or that were rejected because of not being reviewed properly or whatnot, general observations do tend to indicate that non-compliance with internal policies does tend to create substandard applications that have a less likelihood of being funded. In addition to that, so there's obviously the grant submission impact, which is important to everyone. But there's actually, for me, and this is why I'm so passionate about grant deadlines, is the human impact. Being a researcher is so hard. You are working inconsistent hours on research nonstop, and it's an eat what you kill environment, which can be incredibly nerve-wracking. I totally understand as a consultant and having worked in biopharma for years with organizations whose entire livelihood and keeping the lights on depended on them being able to get grants. And so my point of view is that you're keeping a business enterprise running with your grants. So that's very, very, very stressful. I appreciate that perspective. That said, the level of chaos that comes from that kind of desperate need to constantly be submitting grants and being at this level of chaos is not great for them either. That cascades then to research administrators who have a real challenge balancing the workload that they have in general because of a variety of reasons, including the job of the research administrator is typically these days 2.0 FTE. So it's unlikely that any researcher has an RA that's not already managing 2 times the portfolio and doing the jobs of 2.5 people. It's an incredibly difficult, understaffed, and overworked space where RAs are constantly juggling one fire after another. And if you're the 4th PI in a day who's dropped a last-minute application on an RA's lap, there simply isn't enough bandwidth or time to do an adequate and thorough review, which means that in addition to now everybody feeling like they suck at their jobs, they now get to reinforce that fact in their minds by doing only a cursory review. This is a giant impact on research administrators, signature officials, the organizations, the PIs, everybody. Constantly being on call to respond to whatever grant may need to be submitted at any given time leads to chronic stress, which results in exhaustion and then reduced productivity. Our job requires expertise. The work that we do isn't about getting through as many activities as quickly as we can. It's a specialized job that requires precision and thoughtfulness. But for many of the RAs, the exact work we're hired to do is impossible in the face of a never-ending influx of late and last-minute grants. And there was a time, and I'm sure everybody remembers this because we're all old enough to remember that, when they noticed that surgeons were making mistakes and that there was a high mortality rate. And they did some studies, and after doing some research, they discovered that they needed to put limits on the time that surgeons worked on people to ensure there weren't mistakes being made through exhaustion. And they went through that same exercise with air traffic controllers. The same thing is happening to research administrators right now, except we're not surgeons or air traffic controllers, and we did not sign up for this level of intensity and stress. Many organizations and managers accept that having a balanced work-life integration is important. But when it actually comes time to operationalize it, what we're actually mean to say is do everything that we need you to do to get done in the capacity that is expected, regardless of whether it's realistic or not, and then figure out how to be balanced as well on your own time. The balance part is on you, not on us, the giver of all the work and the submitters of the grant. Okay? So now you have somebody who is already overworked, doing 2 worth of work, also getting these late grants, having to be on all the time, trying to balance their lives so they're not draining out every bit of energy that they have. The job isn't designed this way. Like, the truth is, research administration, the job itself is not designed this way. It's what we have allowed it to become. You know what? It is what we have allowed it to become over the years by bypassing best practices in favor of other solutions that look like short-term wins, but in fact are long-term losses. Research administration is a highly specialized career, but for many RAs, it's become more of a constant space of firefighting and dealing with last-minute submissions. This creates resentment on the part of the RA and on the PI. The RA feels like they're lacking control and agency, and the PI feels unsupported and misunderstood. This creates a strong disconnection with institutional goals, ultimately reducing morale and adding to the reason why so many RAs are leaving the field and we're having trouble recruiting new blood. It's also important to recognize that all of these issues are created by a cascading set of problems that start with the lack of boundaries and difficulty saying no, and a challenge in realizing that the solution to some of our problems isn't going to be what you think it's going to be. It's not going to be find a way to work with late grant submissions. It's going to be enforce a deadline or hire more people to work night shifts so that we can hand off our work to people and someone else can take care of them at the last minute. It's hard to at the same time advocate for a bigger research footprint while not submitting more grants. It just is. But then it's even harder to do that and to continue to submit with the limited staff, limited resources, and added to that when there are last minute applications. So the internal deadlines, as we're starting to talk about this, it's part of a bigger picture of change that needs to happen within research administration related to enforcing boundaries. And it's entwined with this other activity, but it is a key, and I would consider it to be one of like those key levers in our jobs where if we could put that fence in place, it would make an enormous difference. Because, it's not just the RAs that are impacted, it's also the PIs. Over the years, I've worked with not just with larger organizations with strong infrastructure to support research, but I've also supported small biopharma. And the way in which PIs who run their own companies submit grants and PIs in academia submit grants is actually remarkably different. I can actually always tell in academia when I get a grant from a PI who has a company on the side, because the kind of grants they submit, the quality and the completeness and the attention to detail and the deadline meeting is very, very different, excruciatingly different from PIs who are exclusively in academia. Most of the time, investigators who have companies on the side will get their grants in early, on time. They're usually pristine. Attention to detail is exquisite. It requires very little review. Even if you have a PI who happens to be really science heavy, who doesn't really do a lot of the administrative stuff, they still have a much more of a stronger understanding of submitting the grants because they've had to learn that skill for their business that runs exclusively on these grants, as opposed to being in academia where there's a whole lot of other infrastructural things. The deadlines are loosey-goosey. And so what it ultimately comes down to is that it is possible to submit these grants on time and in good shape, but it's a matter of developing that skill. What happens, so having supported PIs through both types of submissions, I can say that the impact on the PI is actually very, very intense, right? So there's often a sense of, so for a lot of the investigators that I've worked with who are typically late with applications or don't have like a good framework to prepare and submit applications, there's often a sense of looming dread or panic that they feel like they know they're falling behind on submissions. And so there's always this feeling of rushing to get the grant out the door, which then creates the need to push the deadlines as far as they can. That ultimately makes them overly dependent on RAs to save the submission process, which then exacerbates the feeling of inadequacy for both the RA and the PI. So I've had many PIs tell me that they work better under pressure as a way to justify their procrastination. And then others feel a lot of guilt for overloading their RA, which leads to like strained relationships between the two. And the truth is, I also work better under pressure. But the idea that you can't work under pressure and also have respect for your time and the RA's time is a fallacy. Both things are absolutely possible. It's actually about figuring out how to operationalize submissions so that they create the healthy pressure that you need without feeling like a weight that is on yours and the RA's back. Last minute chaos, one of the other impacts that like this, and this one, I love having great relationships with my investigators, love it. And I mostly have only ever had good relationships. Like we get along great, we have a good time, we submit grants, it's great. But last minute chaos does tend to erode trust and collaboration between PIs and RAs, which can affect the quality of their proposal and create an unhealthy codependent relationship between PI and RA, where they're always working on these last minute submissions and getting the high off of the dopamine when it's submitted. Yeah, we did it. Yeah, nice job. We're a good team, they say. Like, I've done that. High five. We did it. But at the same time, you're currently exhausted. You're constantly exhausted and overworked every submission cycle. Having done this for so long, I've run the gamut in this space. And I've been in the space where I was constantly submitting late grants and high-fiving my PIs and constantly saving the day. And I will tell you, the dopamine hit that I got from saving the day was always so good. I'm so good at my job. But ultimately, what it led to was just constantly being exhausted and feeling like I was behind. So which is an example of that short-term dopamine win, right? But the long-term loss is to burn out. And then ultimately, you can't submit grants at all because then you can't work because you're burnt out. For some investigators, and I have actually had this happen too, where PIs risk becoming isolated from their support networks if their approach alienates their collaborators, because a pattern of late submissions can create a perception of disorganization, which affects not only future funding, but also the PI standing within their department. The research enterprise you're building has more of a purpose than simply getting a grant and then getting another grant. You're trying to build a pipeline of funds coming into your research business, regardless of whether it's a small lab or a giant one in a bigger organization or a standalone lab in biopharma. In my career in educating business owners on how to make and extend the longevity of their funds, this is always the very first thing that we work on, is getting in a cadence of submissions down so that you don't ever feel panicked. It's all just part of the process and part of submitting. Now, this last impact ties into something we talked about earlier, where we talked about there being administratively rejected grants or grants that are rejected because of lack of attention to detail or just not being reviewed properly or what have you, right? And that leads to reduced funding success, which doesn't look good percentage-wise for any investigator. But even more than that, it can seriously impact your morale. Like, that many rejections, it is so hard to submit grants and be rejected constantly. I've worked with investigators who are early in their career, who are late in their career, some who get funded all the time, some who submitted 13 grants and never got funded, and it is soul crushing, right? So if we can create an environment in which we can have a strong foundation for investigators to submit so that we can mitigate the rejections that would come from things that are easily preventable by simply submitting it on time, why wouldn't we do that, right? And that is a shift in thinking, because we don't typically tend to go in that direction. Now, this issue that we run into is more commonly found in larger organizations with multiple research administrative departments, where there's a culture of late submissions rather than an organization that has their deadlines on lockdown with just a few people who struggle with meeting the deadlines. So you're not going to have a cultural problem if there's just a couple of people doing this. But if you have, like, late grants are chronic, then you're going to have a culture problem. The first is going to be that a submit at all costs rule institutionalizes a culture of last minute scrambling and crisis management. And then that permeates in other areas of the organization. There's a lot of high impact, critically time sensitive items related to already funded grants that have to get shelved because the deadline is all. So often there's this expectation that when the submission is over, the RA will go back and just pick up where they left off on whatever it was that is highly sensitive that needed to get taken care of, that is post-award management. But there is a lot lost during the context switching at this level. And in order to maximize the expertise that we bring to the table, we actually need to be able to manage our energy, our workflow, and our time appropriately without the fear of a last-minute grant or 10 last-minute grants derailing some very, very important work that needs to get done to maintain post-award fiscal compliance. Another cultural issue that happens is staff and faculty begin to accept inefficiency and low-quality work as the norm, because each person feels like they have no choice but to do just the best they can and then hope for the best. I cannot tell you how defeated some people sound when they talk about grants. Like, it is really, it's heartbreaking, right? I'm talking about fellows, PIs, RAs, and their direct managers. There is a general feeling of resignation that comes when nothing changes and deadlines aren't enforced that completely demoralizes your workforce and discourages investigators from submitting and RAs from even staying in the field. When deadlines are optional and rules aren't enforced, employees at all levels feel less compelled to adhere to any standards, and the lack of accountability creates a ripple effect where other policies, practices, and initiatives are then also ignored. And then at a certain point, the culture becomes whatever, nobody cares anyway. And once that happens, I'll be honest, it's actually time for a complete overhaul. Just recently, we heard of an entire research department that turned over in the span of just a few weeks or months as a direct result from this kind of culture problem. This particular note is one of my near and dear to my heart ones, is that it actually, not having an internal deadline hurts your secret weapon that you have in your organization. A culture of constant urgency disproportionately impacts marginalized groups who may already face systemic challenges in balancing work-life demands, and employees with caregiving responsibilities or health concerns are particularly affected, leading to inequities in retention and advancement. Rather, I want to actually talk about the cost to the institution of taking actions that have this particular kind of consequence, specifically in the context of research administration. The job of research admin is one where sometimes the answer is black and white. No, you can't put your bar tab on this federally sponsored project, or any research project for that matter. Star sign. Unless. It depends, right? Others are gray areas. There's so many gray areas. The catchphrase of our entire industry is "it depends." And those are the ones where you have to thread the needle between multiple, sometimes competing or close to competing policies and guidelines. Use your interpretation to figure out whether something is or is not possible, and do it all while ensuring that you're maintaining the highest level of compliance and fiscal responsibility. That is a lot to ask, and it is a very, very specific and particular skill set. And frankly, not one that you get taught in any school or degree program. This is a skill that comes from experiences. Now, people have a varying level of experience in threading needles to where you can achieve your goals while also being compliant. Now, imagine groups of people who have the experience of threading the needle, not once, not twice, but thousands of times every day, your entire life. It makes you really, really good at it. And that's the group that we're talking about. When you grow up and exist in a world that is not designed for you, and because we are all temporarily abled, when you get to a point or have a situation when the world is not designed for you, you learn how to be successful in that life, in society, in jobs, in 1,000 things, only if you know how to thread that needle. And that transferable skill makes these groups excellent, incredible, oh my God-like candidates for research administration. And when an organization's policies are structured around chaos, you're making a choice to exclude this incredible resource from the pool of RAs. And we are in a time that I think we're going to look back on as the great RA dying. We're losing more RAs than we're bringing in. Can we really afford to marginalize our very best candidates? Strategic consequences. There are also strategic consequences to the investigator. We are not just compliance experts. We have submitted grant after grant after grant, and we've learned what works and what doesn't. Some RAs fall in love with that process so much that they start working with PIs directly to help them get funded, like Holly Zink, Sarah Dobson, Beth Knoll, Aline Nandelstat. Those are some people that come to mind. These are people who don't just help you make sure your font is Arial 11, they will guide PIs into submitting the best application with the highest likelihood for funding possible. Beth in particular is gifted at advising on the science and connecting collaborating investigators together. That kind of expertise elevates the institution and the investigator in their submission, which creates a body of proposals that gets progressively more likely to get funded. I have worked with dozens of PIs who understand the value of this expertise, and they have gone on to have robust portfolios and a diverse way of funding their labs. And over the years, I've watched incredibly talented investigators consistently be rejected for funding because they are so focused on just writing the science, they don't realize that a grant proposal is a pitch. And your pitch has to be top notch because every other investigator in the world is also making a pitch. And sometimes the difference is going to be what kind of final product did you put together to ask for a little under 2.5 million from them. For some investigators, you start to get a reputation in terms of the grants that you submit. Oh, that PI, they have the science, but they cannot figure out how to pull work together in an actionable research project that can actually get funded. If there is consistency across an organization in terms of lower quality proposals being submitted, then it starts to damage the reputation of the organization as well. And lastly, and this one is real in every aspect of the work we do, regardless of whether you're research, clinical, administrative, it doesn't actually matter. The chaos of poorly enforced policies means valuable time and resources are spent putting out fires than developing competitive, innovative proposals. And the more experts have their attention focused on firefighting, the less that the organization's long-term strategic goals will be met. Organizationally, it can often feel like getting the grants out the door, no matter what, is all that matters, and that's just good practice. But the truth is, without having clear deadlines that are enforced and a workforce that feels supported, you're going to lose more people, making it even harder to submit grants. Ultimately, each challenge will feed into the other until the infrastructure itself collapses. We are already seeing organizations whose entire research administrative teams all walked off at once because the conditions are untenable, which is indicative of a systemic issue. This isn't just happening at PUIs or larger systems. It's a giant problem in research administration literally across the country. And though having an internal deadline isn't really going to solve all of these problems right off the bat, look, I love internal deadlines, but it's not that powerful. However, it is one of the pieces that once put in place can have a huge cascading impact for good, right? So right now it's having a giant cascading impact for bad. It can have the same cascading impact for good. Now, we've talked about all the horror stories, but let's talk about what the benefits are, right? So we've gone through all the negatives of what are the consequences and the impact of not having internal grant deadlines that are met. Let's talk about what the benefits of adhering to internal grant deadlines are, the positives of this. So first, you get a comprehensive review. Submitting proposal by internal deadlines allows institutional offices, such as the Office of Sponsor Programs, to conduct thorough reviews. This process ensures that the proposals comply with sponsor guidelines, budgets are accurate, and all necessary approvals are secured, which increases the likelihood of funding success and award success. It gives us the opportunity to identify and rectify errors or omissions that could otherwise lead to proposal rejection. This includes addressing budget issues, missing narrative components, or non-compliance with sponsor guidelines. Oh, this one's a big one. So the next one is a big one. It's avoiding technical issues. So meeting internal deadlines reduces the risk of last-minute technical problems that can arise during electronic submissions, ensuring that proposals are submitted in a smooth and on-time way. Now, I had a proposal once that was completed 15 minutes before the deadline. 15 minutes. It was supposed to be submitted on Assist. And the problem was that there was some sort of technical issue happening with Assist at the time, and only one person could get into it as the SO. And that person was in a yoga class. Right? We literally had to chase this person into their yoga studio, pull them out of class, embarrassing them in the process, and disrupting the class and the workflow of another organization, interfering with their private time to get them to get this grant submitted. That is wrong on like so many levels, and it could easily have been mitigated with a culture shift of prioritizing timelines and people over submitting at all costs. More than that, though, what if we hadn't been able to get a hold of this person? The grant wouldn't have gone in. What if we didn't know this person was at their yoga class and we didn't know where their yoga class was so we could call them, right? Like, these are the things that we have to think about in terms of the deadline. It's really not just about do what we're telling you to do as much as it's about we know the things that can happen when a grant is submitted 10 minutes before the sponsor deadline. So if the grant had, let's say, been submitted 5 to 7 days before the last minute, that would have given us ample time to solve the problem without it becoming an emergency. I remember that day so vividly because the PI kept saying it was an emergency. It was an emergency when it really was an emergency of their own making, right? No one wants to submit a grant that way, not even a PI. But often we don't actually know how to make the change, right? How do we shift? How do we turn this ship when we have been submitting grants at all costs with no internal deadline enforcement and everybody's been running around and submitting whenever they want, as late as they want? How do you make that change on both the PI, the RA, the institutional, and on a culture level? That is a big ship to turn. And that's kind of why I wanted to make this video, because organizations have been doing this for years. They have turned the ship and they've established these deadlines and enforced them, and it's successful. So it is possible, right? So like we've seen people do it. We know it's possible. How do we do it, right? So here are some suggestions for how you may get started. It starts with the expectations and boundaries. For honestly, like regardless of whatever you put in place, you really have to think about it on a conceptual level first, that it starts with expectations and boundaries. As much as I wish it didn't, that's always where we begin for this. Clear internal deadlines for proposal submissions, 5 days before the sponsor deadline, 3 days before the sponsor deadline, whatever you decide, you need to make sure that they're clear. It protects the RAs and it provides structure for the PIs. They need to be written policies that are enforced by the organization with zero tolerance. This isn't to be a hard ass as much as it's to set up a strong framework for success. You don't build a building with rebar made of Play-Doh. You pick strong shit because it needs to bear the weight of an entire structure and everything that goes into it. The same is true for our submissions. The framework under which we work is what builds the success or failures of the future. So as horrid as it sounds, boundaries are very important. Strong, firm, clear. The organizations then need to enforce that boundary and back up their research administrators, both educating them on the policy and teaching them how to set and maintain boundaries. Saying no is not something that we are taught how to do, so a lot of times we can come off as a bit abrupt, or honestly, I've come off sounding like an asshole sometimes when I was enforcing the boundaries early on in my career. And so we don't necessarily always realize that the way we set a boundary and maintain it in our messaging can make a huge difference. So it's a powerful professional development skill, and I would strongly recommend any organization that is going to implement a policy of internal deadlines to also at the same time either have their staff watch my series on boundaries on Minessa.tv or have a coach come in to work with them about workshopping language, emails that you can send to make sure that as these boundaries are being enforced where they were not enforced before, It's a gentle rollout as opposed to a suddenly like, no, I'm not submitting your grant, get lost, right? Like that's not what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do is change patterns of behavior, and that doesn't happen through abrupt no's. It happens through slow guidance. So once the RAs are educated, then they are then going to educate the investigators, and that is something that really that's a process and a skill set that needs to be taught. It's not something you'll be able to say, okay, we now have this institutional guideline where you can't submit your grant after 7 business days. Let's say it's going to be late, and now the people are saying, your RAs are saying, no, we're not going to submit it, right? Any PI who gets that is going to resist that deadline. But if it's messaged differently, you might be able to get a different response. Now, in the event that there are exceptions that are going to be allowed, you want to create a framework where urgent last-minute submissions must be approved by higher leadership to discourage procrastination. More importantly, a list of people who are chronic abusers of the deadline policy needs to be given their own training. So we don't need to come up with whole new policies for the whole institution because of these few people who are struggling. Rather, we need to pull those few people who are struggling out and figure out why are you struggling and how can we help get you to a space where you feel like you can submit grants while respecting the deadline. Running a research enterprise is a business, and sometimes the problem is something else. Is this a new investigator who needs to be educated on planning? Or is this a more experienced investigator who is so busy they just aren't noticing how time is passing? And are there things we can do to support them with meeting those deadlines? There are a lot of steps on the road to making the change of getting all grants in before the internal deadline, and we should explore all of them. So this is a lot of conceptual stuff that we've been talking about, like ideas, things that this is generally the framework that we need to, right, that we need to approach this from. So the question becomes then, okay, that's great, Manessa, I am on board. Let's just say that you've heard this and you're like, I'm so on board, I'm going to do all the internal deadlines. There will be internal deadlines. We will enforce them. Rock on. How do we do this? So, well, number one is talk to other people who already implemented them. That's number one. This, like I said, this video is my sort of like, this is my rundown of internal deadlines because I wanted to have a springboard for conversation about it. But ultimately, there's a lot of references in here. I've mentioned a lot of organizations. Check them out. See what they did. How did they implement it? Which ones do you like? Which ones do you not like? And reach out to people. If you're a member of NCURA, and if you're not, become one, reach out to them through NCURA Connect and figure out how they implemented it. What were some of the problems? Somebody's already solved this problem. The truth of the matter is at this point, there are a ton of organizations that already have internal deadlines in place. They turned the ship. Turning that ship was no doubt very difficult. Reaching out to them and figuring out how they mitigated some of their issues will be very helpful to you. However, here's some operational ideas that you may want to think about as you are going through this process. The first is having some templates for your emails for subawards, PI reminders, and so on. Creating standardized templates for communicating with subawards, including specific deadlines, required documents, contacts for questions. When I get a grant going, there are a few things I do immediately just to get the ball rolling, and then once it's on the track, I use Asana to do it, and then it kind of like keeps me on track. So there's a couple of steps I take immediately when I know about a grant, and then I kind of put it in my project manager and just kind of let it roll after that. I talk more about my project manager in the Commitment to Clock Out series, but whatever way you use, and having the ability to just have these template emails and then something that says, okay, send email 5 to all of these people, send email 6 to all these people, then you don't have to it's not a lot of work for us to continuously remind people to make sure that we get things on time. This is a way that RAs can sort of continuously ping people, because a lot of times we get caught. I know it happens to me. I get caught up and then it's 2 weeks later, I'm like, shit, I need to get this. So I had to put some stuff in place that would ping me periodically so that I could check in. This one cycle I had 18 grants, so I had to be really on top of each and every one to make sure that I didn't get any, if I would not have been able to accommodate any grants that came in late because there were 18. If they'd all come in late, it just wouldn't have gone in. So the other thing you can do is drafting recurring emails to send to investigators asking if they have grants due and reminding them of upcoming deadlines. You can use Outlook, Gmail, internal systems to automate some of these emails, or to just keep templates or sort of pre-written emails so that you can send them out. So much of what we do may not be able to be automated because it's subjective to each individual submission, but you can have a framework that you can reuse and adapt moderately. So for example, I may have about 5 emails that I've built over the years sending to a PI to check in on a grant at strategic times, 90 days, 60 days, 30 days, and then maybe weekly and then daily, right, leading up to the deadline. So these emails are often pre-written and they're all ready to go. And I use the Asana to ping me whenever the next time is I need to remind them for any individual grant. And then I just copy paste it into the email. But if I get an email from them midweek, right? I'll give it a quick once over and then just put it in the folder because I know that later on this week, Asana's going to remind me about it, and that's going to be the time I'm working on the submission. So having these regular reminders allows me to set up pockets of time where I can say, I'm going to work on the submission now. And then doing it that way actually gives you the ability to creating that loop. It gives you the ability to give the submission process a cadence. The first time is not always going to be a cadence. It's actually just going to be trying to figure out the cadence. You're going to feel like you're stumbling and smashing your face on a wall. But after you've done it a few times, you'll figure out your own cadence and say, okay, these are the emails I'm going to send, and you'll just have them all in a folder and go with it. You also, I recommend strongly using tools like Outlook, Google Calendar, grant management software, Monday, ClickUp, any project management software, whatever tools that you already use in your life. Think about this. You may have tools that you use in your personal life that keep you organized. Are there parallels, right? Are there parallels? Or if you feel like, okay, I could use Outlook and use the signature option to put all my templates in there. And then that way, whenever I send out an email, I'll just pick the right template and then it'll all be written. Whatever it is, start to think about the tools that exist within the software that you already have, and think about how those might be able to help you. In the emails that you send, if there are checklists, so I have a couple of checklists that I send out to like the sub awards and to the PI, depending on what it is that's needed. I'm always going to need some of the same things. And if you have a portfolio that's specific to you, you can then, you'll know that, okay, cardiology submits to these 4 sponsors and the NIH is like this and American Heart is like this and so on. So you can have your various templates. If you don't have checklists, I always love making a good checklist. You can message me. You can also Google it online to see what you can find and repurpose what somebody else has used. Again, so I cannot stress enough leveraging project management tools like Asana, Trello, Monday.com to track grant submissions for yourself. Even if you have an internal grant system with your organization that you use to submit grants that keeps track of your tasks, typically it's not enough to actually ensure that you don't lose the workflow. Not just the workflow like for the grant, but the workflow of the grant within your larger workflow, right? This is true for PIs, their staff, RAs, you name it. Using a project management tool, even if you're using the most basic of functions, which I do, I literally use the most basic of Asana functions, it is a critical element to creating freedom from that chaos. If you do use a project manager, then you can create what I call a submissions master task for each cycle and then link in each individual grant task to this master list for easy tracking. The benefits of these systems is that they automate reminder subtasks and timelines to make sure nothing is overlooked. That's how I do mine, but I'm sure that there are plenty of other effective ways of doing it. I would absolutely love for you to share what your way of managing your deadlines are, because one size does not fit all, not in the least, especially for this. And so what I'd love to hear is like, how do you keep track and like make sure that you don't drop the ball when you have so many balls to juggle? But now, in addition to the things that we as RAs can do to help keep the ball rolling and like make sure the PIs are on top, the PIs also need their own training. We need to identifying someone who is an internal expert with a strong submission track record, preferably an investigator who's already done it, and using them and record a training to PIs on managing deadlines, right? Not talking about how do you submit a grant, but someone who typically submits on time and has everything organized, having a conversation with them through your professional development office or your research administration training office, talking about what is your workflow? How do you stay on top of things? When do you start submitting? How do you look for grants? Things like that, to help other investigators get an idea of operationally, how do you do this? I've known PIs who were the most effective grant writers, and they are so organized, they have their shit together. In fact, one of them, John Frangione, was the blueprint for much of what I did in the future. His organization it's beyond compare, and he's successful. So what that tells us is that if you organize and you train your investigators to work in an organized fashion, like this is a research business, it will greatly increase their chances of successful submissions. Now, this starts with making sure that all fellows are given a basic training on grant submissions, IDC, deadlines, etc., and having one for PIs who are ready to submit for the Ks and Rs in another set. By the time I meet with some of my PIs that I've worked with, they've already been doing this for many years, so whatever their habits are, they're pretty much set, organized or not. Okay, so I've had investigators who've been submitting for decades, and by the time I meet them, they've already locked down how they submit grants, right? But by the time I leave organizations and departments, the ones who were typically not organized, they have a strong organizational system in place because I work with them to train them on how to organize their workflow, what they want to get done when. It really does make a difference. That said, not every organization has a plethora of PIs or RAs to tap for training. That said, not every organization has a plethora of PIs to tap for training. In which case, there are incredible consultants. Holly Zink or Sarah Dobson are coaches and consultants who work specifically with investigators to help them get their grants written and submitted effectively. And working with them will build your library. Having them come in to conduct workshops or one-on-one sessions. I've done a few workshops with Emmanuel, Dana-Farber, Harvard, BIDMC, all of which are geared towards helping investigators learn the organizational components of grant submission so that when the time comes, the submission itself is smooth as silk. Ideally, get them to train on something you can record, right? So whatever trainings you get, record it. And that way you can deliver it to all new investigators when they come in, and it will be the gift that keeps giving. Now, there is something to be said for building an educational infrastructure like handbooks and the like, right? Creating a PI handbook or guide outlining the grant submission process, timelines, and key contexts. These have limited use in that most people never read these once they're published because we forget they're there. I made a document years ago. It was gorgeous. It took me months. And then we all forgot we made it. And we never sent people to it. So when you do make these handbooks, and you may already have them, that's the other part. You may already have these in your organization. Make sure that you're taking advantage of them. And part of that is on us. When someone asks us a question or asks us for help, sometimes it's honestly just easier to give them the answer than it is to show them where to find the answer. Plus, everybody wants to be seen as helpful. I mean, at least I do. And I am a people pleaser to the core. Like, I know that. And I work really hard to mitigate it because this is not something I say where I'm a people pleaser, so I'm just going to do the thing. This is, I'm a people pleaser. What action is that leading me to do that is not in the best interest of the person that I'm talking to? The best interest would be for me to show them how to do it so that they don't feel reliant on me, right? So I have to work on that in therapy because truthfully, it maintains the status quo if you don't teach them how, of them always feeling like they need something and us always taking time out of whatever it is that we're doing to help with that thing. But what if instead we leveraged all the tools we had and set and maintain boundaries and then use the time to get back to helping people with the things that there are no resources for, right? That have to be us doing it. That is really tough to do. So I would recommend, again, watching my video series on boundaries, shameless plug, because that's where we massage that a bit out there. Having regular check-ins with your investigators are super important. I hate meetings more than anything, like just in general, like I just don't like being in meetings because I feel like it disrupts my exciting workflow. Have regular ones set up, or if they don't submit that often, schedule periodic one-on-one meetings with PIs to review submission statuses, address obstacles, and identify upcoming deadlines. Something that we don't do, though, in addition, something that we don't do. I hate doing these. I hate doing these. So, like, I'm saying this as someone who doesn't do them. But I'm just going to tell you, they're still valuable, regardless of whether you do them or not. Some people like doing them, which is why I put it out there. After each grant cycle, host a review session with your PIs to identify what worked well and what needs improvement, and use those insights to refine workflows and resources that then will allow your next submission to be even better, right? Educate your PIs to utilize online grant writing forums, webinars, and academic blogs to gather new ideas on successful strategies. They can use Reddit. Reddit has a whole bunch of stuff too. Subscribe to newsletters like Science Careers, Research Development, and Grant Writing News, or grants.gov updates for ongoing insights in that case. Sarah Dobson and Holly Zink also have great newsletters, but really it's about giving the PIs the opportunity to get the training dripped out to them so that they can sort of like, oh, look, that looks interesting. Oh, look, that looks interesting. And over the course of time, be getting the message from a variety of different places that slowly helps to build that strong research submission infrastructure. Lastly, and this one is probably the most important. So if your culture is later is okay, we always have time, we'll submit the grant no matter what, then it takes a while to change the mindset to a ready to submit mindset where, you know, you're trying, where they feel like I'm always ready to submit. I'm ready to submit now, right? And even within organizations, no one likes to air the dirty laundry of other people. So rather than negative examples saying, well, that person in the organization submitted late and look what happened to them, right? Instead, maybe using case studies of successful submissions to illustrate the benefits of proactive planning. And so that really is where it comes down to, you know, polling your RAs to say, okay, who is really good at submitting, and seeing if you can get a panel together to have that conversation about what results in a successful submission in terms of preparation and planning. Now, here's the thing. Some of the suggestions for how to do this puts the onus on the RA, and others on the institution, and others on the investigator. And it's because setting up an internal deadline is, like I said earlier, is only part of the process. There are necessarily behavior modifications that have to happen before you can implement, operationalize, and turn grant submissions routine. Otherwise, it's like saying you're going to be fluent in Arabic by December and your action item and plan is be fluent in Arabic. Simply having the word and statement is not going to be enough. There's a framework, a process, behavioral changes that collaborate together to create that successful turning of the ship. Now, I do want to touch on one thing about having, like, and this is actually super important, and so I kind of left it for the last because it has a really bad impact. So when an organization has an internal deadlines that labeled as best practices, but they don't actually enforce them and then simultaneously require that all grants be submitted regardless of their condition, this creates an incredibly dysfunctional system that negatively impacts the institution, its culture, and the individuals within it. It can cause policies to lose legitimacy, and both employees and PIs may see the organization as inconsistent or unprofessional, undermining trust and leadership. External partners and funding agencies may view the institution as disorganized, potentially damaging its reputation, which is further exacerbated by getting fewer grants due to those administrative oversights. Moreover, without meaningful enforcement, resources are wasted in scrambling to meet last-minute demands other than being used strategically to ensure high-quality submissions. Overall, what that means is that no one is giving or getting their best, and ultimately that's going to hinder the overarching goals that many organizations have to increase their research footprint and enterprise. You can't do one without the other, though I'll be honest, we all wish it was so. The fences and ground rules are what makes it possible for us to grow, not submissions submitted at all costs, right? So it's over the years, I've seen this in, I can't even tell you how many industries. This is not unique to research administration. This is actually a chronic problem that runs the gamut. We see fences and ground rules as something that restricts us, but the truth of the matter is the fences and ground rules are what make it possible for the growth. They make it possible for us to submit good applications that get funded. They are what create the possibility, though we think that as long as we get all the grants out at all costs, that's what does it. So I want you to imagine, if you are getting grants still and you're submitting grants at all costs, I want you to imagine how many more grants you could get if you were not doing it that way, right? That means that what you consider to be successful right now is only the tip of the iceberg of what could be possible if you put these boundaries and guidelines in place, right? This was supposed to be a quick 10-minute video, but as I dug deeper into the things that I've been talking about with RAs on the ground, their supervisors, their managers, and pulled out some of our notes, the longer the video became, and I think it's a testament to how difficult a conversation this is. And for a lot of spaces I've worked in the past, you have to convene committees and have conversations, and everybody has to have a say in everything, and every change takes forever. And these are the same conversations that are happening everywhere. Maybe you're talking about this exact thing in your office right now and trying to figure out how to do it. I think the message that I'd like for you to take away is that it doesn't have to be perfect, and no one's going to like it because change is hard, but it is worth doing. And it's worth doing fast, like really fast and really soon rather than later. Once you implement it, and then you can adapt it as you go, right? Just throw something out there and get started. Once you implement it, you will wonder why you didn't do it sooner. And if you have already implemented and are willing to share your wisdom, please let us know in the comments. Send me an email. I'd also love to interview you for my RA interview series, because I feel like the more we have conversations about this, the more we share what our experiences are, the faster and easier it's going to be for us collectively as research administrators to turn the ship in our own organizations with a minimal amount of fuss. Thank you so much for joining me on this, our research administration in a nutshell, that turned out to be not so much of a nutshell. If you found this helpful, please drop a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and be sure to share this out to your friends and family members and community and everybody and their grandmother, so we can get more and more input on what people are doing for internal deadlines. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.